At the Ayn Rand Institute, we're the custodians of Ayn Rand's legacy. This includes not only her intellectual legacy and her philosophy, but also her material heritage, her physical writings, her correspondence, and her media appearances throughout her life. But our responsibility extends beyond mere preservation. We aim to expand her legacy's impact and bring new material to light, helping people better understand Rand's philosophy and life. And so, to that end, and through the Ayn Rand Archives, we regularly unearth previously unreleased materials, including a 1960 Mike Wallace interview with Rand that has been unavailable to the public until very recently. Welcome to New Ideal, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Agustina Vergara Cid, and I am an associate fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. And with me is Brandon Lisi, who is an archivist at ARI. Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you so much for having me, Augustina. It's great to be here.
So I can't stress enough how excited I am that we are still releasing material that has never seen before. That it's either interviews with Rand or appearances that she made. Like all these years later and all these years after her passing, I think it's incredible that we're still able to release this new material. And I'm very, very excited for people to watch, particularly this interview, which was recorded in 1960, as I understand it, but it hasn't been made public until we at the Ayn Rand Institute recently did that. So, Brandon, can you say a little bit more about why this was kind of like Mike Wallace's and Ayn Rand's lost interview? And we're familiar with the other interview that Rand did with Wallace, and we've seen it. It's an interview that has gone viral. It has over 1 million views in our channel. But this one, we didn't know it even, meaning the public probably didn't know it even existed. Can you say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think that video you mentioned, so this is Ayn Rand and Mike Wallace's first interview together, which was recorded in February of 1959. That has now over 2 million views as of this recording. Oh, wow. And so it's really popular. We also have on our YouTube channel the fourth interview that Ayn Rand did with Mickey Spillane. That was in October of 1961. But there are two more interviews that were not online, that were not being surfaced, that were not out there. And so when I got involved in the archives, one of the things that I was really interested in is there are these interviews that we have records for because we have Ayn Rand's day at a glance, week at a glance calendars. We have the newspaper clippings that she collected. So we knew that these interviews existed, but we didn't have the recordings and they weren't on YouTube. So it was really just an absolute an honor, really, to help bring this to the public. And what I'll say is the reason why we described it as a lost interview, we kind of put that in quotes, because, like I said, we knew that it existed. We had a copy in the archives, but it wasn't a copy that you could share widely. It wasn't something that sounded particularly good. So I think we'll say more at the end of the podcast about how we got this interview, about what the work in the archives looks like. But simply, this is an interview that we just released that has pretty much never been heard outside of an archival context since it was first broadcast on May 4th, 1960.
All right, so for those of us who weren't alive during that time and some of us may not be very familiar with who Mike Wallace was, can you tell us a little bit more about him and what impact his interview show had in the culture more broadly?
Oh, yeah. Well, so I think most people, when you hear Mike Wallace's name, most people associate him with his later work on 60 Minutes. He was somebody who, over the span of a decades-long career, interviewed presidents, heads of state from around the world, people like Malcolm X, celebrities like Barbra Streisand. I mean, he was everywhere, did a lot of interviews that made a pretty significant, I think, cultural impact. So the videos that we have of Wallace and Rand are actually somewhat earlier in his career, but he was still making an impact at that time. Now, to just give you a little bit of the background, I would say that television at this time in America is taking on a new importance in American life and culture. So this same year that this interview comes out, we have the first televised U.S. presidential debate, which is, a very widely watched sort of broadcast. And so Mike Wallace is right there in the middle of this crossroads when you have this explosion of televisions in American homes. And he's somebody who gets a reputation as somebody who is just developing really sort of hard-nosed, like tough interviews, and sets up his studio almost like a police interrogation film, like the full blackout, like black backgrounds, the slow camera zoom on the guest, as though it's like the person is being interrogated. So to kind of just give you one anecdote that I think really captures the whole Mike Wallace experience, if you will. He's somebody who he interviews a journalist by the name of Drew Pearson in 1957. So Drew Pearson, he was a Washington Post journalist who had sort of gotten in a lot of trouble with, like, you know, sort of stories that he had written. And to give you a sense of like how Mike Wallace interviews people, he was very used to interviewing people who almost like had something to hide. So he, like, kind of as they're wrapping up his interview with Drew Pearson, Mike Wallace asked him, you have a rather remarkable record for being called names. I mean, Roosevelt called you a vicious liar. Truman called you a chronic liar. Senator McKellar, he called you an ignorant liar, a pusillanimous liar, a liar by day and a liar by night. What is it about you that inspires such bitterness? And Drew Pearson kind of starts stumbling through the answer, stutters a little bit, and he says, well, I can't give an objective answer on that. And Wallace just interrupts him and says, well, could it be that you're a liar? so that just gives you, I think, a little bit of a sense of Mike Wallace's interview style, how tough he could be. He really pushed people for answers. And at this time in his career, that interview that I mentioned with Pearson got him in quite a bit of trouble. So one of the things that came up in that interview, Pearson alleges that John F. Kennedy, this is while he was still a senator from Massachusetts, not yet the American president, Drew Pearson basically says on the Mike Wallace interview that, Jack Kennedy, he's the first person to win a Pulitzer Prize for a book that he didn't even write. So he basically says that John F. Kennedy's book was something he didn't even write. And Joseph Kennedy, the president's father, basically says to ABC News, which had been broadcasting the show at that time, basically filed a lawsuit for $50 million. So got the whole thing in the whole studio in a ton of trouble. They had to issue an apology and a retraction, and it ultimately led to Mike Wallace leaving ABC basically at the end of that year, or I think it was like in '59 or so. So at the time that he's doing the interviews with Rand, he's actually on a local New York TV show, but that is only just to underscore, I think, the kind of impact that he was having nationally, even though at the time of these interviews, it was just a local New York television station.
You mentioned that, so the Rand interview was recorded in 1960, and you mentioned earlier that around that time is when the first presidential debate was televised. So
Yeah.
what else was going on in America and the world at that point, in history? So because Rand talks a little bit about her, the issues that were topical of the time in this interview.
Yeah, well, it's the biggest thing, of course, is the Cold War. It's at the forefront of everyone's mind. It's the thing that everybody wants to know about. And I think if you ask people who were alive at that time, as I've had occasion to do at times, I think the chronic fear was the threat of nuclear war. And I think people had this chronic anxiety about our leaders have no idea what they're doing. We have these two superpowers that have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. This is about 2 years prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we are very literally like at a time when we're at very close to nuclear war, and people know it. And people don't feel like they can look to their leaders for any kind of actually sort of intellectual, moral guidance. And we're essentially like lost in this sort of sea of what will become in the later 1960s, this sort of disillusionment with the establishment. And I think you start to see the beginnings of that in 1960. And it's something that I think comes through in this interview. And it's really, I think it's a great opportunity for Rand to provide that moral intellectual guidance and to showcase how the intellectuals had failed. And that's really, I think, the main takeaway that I have from this particular interview.
Yes, and for sure guidance she gives. But before we turn to that, because I do want to talk about that, can you give us just a flavor of what Rand was up to at that point?
Mm,
Because, she had different stages of her career. So in 1960, what did
yeah.
Rand's career look like? Was she already this extremely famous, popular philosopher and novelist, or where was she in her career?
Well, it's certainly true that she was a best-selling novelist. So, of course, in 1957, she publishes Atlas Shrugged. That is sort of the big project in her life up to that point. She set out as a fiction writer to, in her words, capture her ideal man and ideal view of existence. And with Atlas Shrugged, she had essentially achieved that, right? So now it's like a very crucial shift in her career, which is not to say she hadn't been a public intellectual in the past. She had volunteered and done some speech writing for the Wendell Willkie campaign in 1940 for his presidential campaign. She had testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947. But this is really a time where, because of all of the negative reviews for Atlas Shrugged, and I think she felt like there's sort of a lack of defense of the ideas that I'm putting forth in this novel. If nobody will defend it, then I will. And that's really where I think Mike Wallace certainly deserves a lot of credit, because he first interviews her in his column that actually occurs, I think, about a month before or right up to the publication of Atlas Shrugged, and then has her on his TV show starting in 1959. They do a total of 4 interviews. These are her first. Or the one in 1959 is her first television interview. And my now retired colleague, Tom Bowden, has always referred to Mike Wallace as sort of a one-man publicity machine for Ayn Rand. So I think Mike Wallace here deserves some credit, at least, for helping to put Rand more into the public spotlight. Because he was such a prominent journalist and such a prominent interviewer, this definitely helped her to get further television interviews, radio interviews. And throughout the 1960s, she would be on radio and television throughout that decade. I mean, she did over like 50 broadcasts on WBAI Pacifica Radio, and, of course, all of the nonfiction works that she started publishing at that time in her career. So really what's cool about this interview, in addition to just the content, is that you get to see Rand at like a crucial moment in her career where she's transitioning from this sort of like being primarily a fiction writer, somebody who's, presenting her works in fiction, and now she's presenting these ideas in nonfiction and in, really, I think, embracing the role of a public intellectual.
That is amazing. And let's recall,
Yeah.
at that point, being on the radio and on TV was such a big deal because there weren't as many media, obviously, as we have today with the internet.
Yeah.
So, Brandon, I want to encourage, obviously, everyone to go watch this interview, and we're going to tell them how in a little bit. But can you give us a flavor of what sort of topic Wallace asks Rand about? Like, what do they converse about?
Yeah, well, you hit a wide range of subjects actually throughout this interview. He does bring up, questions about, the sort of the meaning of life. Who are the people you most admire? But I think the bulk of the interview that, really takes up the majority of the time is the relationship between sort of America and the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, how our leaders are responding to it. So he really like peppers her with some questions about that. And like one of the things that comes up is, Dwight Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, talked about how he had trouble sort of answering criticisms from the Soviet Union Marshal Zhukov, who was, the marshal of the Soviet Union during World War II, this famous war hero. And he's like sort of criticizing America. And Eisenhower confesses that he actually isn't able to, answer some of these criticisms. And Rand basically pounces on that to say that, look, this is exactly the problem, that this is a great illustration of the bigger issue, that like the president of the freest country in the world is unable to actually like answer what she calls a prehistoric brute, this sort of evil empire of the Soviet Union. And I think that just goes to show you that, she was really focused on that relationship as a really important issue. And even though other issues come out, that's really, I think that was the thing that I think the American public and American culture, that's what they needed guidance on at the time. And so she's really fixated on that as a particular topic in this interview.
So, for those that want to watch the interview, obviously,
Yeah.
if they watch it, they're going to learn some about the history, but she really does talk a lot about topics that are important at the time in the 1960s. So,
Yeah.
what other value can people get from watching the interview other than, this historical value from it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because even though these issues came up in 1960, there's still issues today in the ways in which America does not have a proper moral and intellectual defense, and that the kinds of people who are offering the defense of America are basically saying that, we're the sort of national conservatives, or, we're defending it on the grounds of religion, and that it's the opposite side. It's the Soviets who are claiming the sanction of reason. And she's saying this is a big problem, right? That the defense of capitalism needs a defense on moral and intellectual grounds, and she's here to offer it. And particularly when it comes to America standing up to these totalitarian regimes on the other side of the world. Well, of course, we're still dealing with that. And her answer is, we need to proudly state that the Soviet Union, in her words, she says, you are bloody monsters, in fact, and ours is a country of justice and life. And so that's exactly the kind of guidance that I think America needs today. Much as we still wouldn't like it to be an issue, it still is an issue. Unfortunately, what is it now, 64 years later? So
Yeah, I think part of
yeah,
what's extremely attractive about this interview, it's because Rand talks in principle, right? Not just in this interview, but everywhere. We've basically, if you're a fan of Rand, you have encountered posts on social media or sometimes in the mainstream media saying, like quoting Rand on a particular topic, and people saying, "Oh, I feel like she could have written this today." Well, I think
yeah,
that's the case for this interview as well. Like a lot of everything, essentially, she says has a lot of value to be applied today because she speaks philosophically and in principle, while still tying the principles to the concretes, right?
yeah.
So, what reaction did this interview get from the public at the time? How was it received?
Yeah, well, the we thanks to the Ayn Rand Archives, we have ample evidence of this. I think the best example that I can give, and people can read about this in either the book, The Letters of Ayn Rand, or the online exhibit that we have up online, where all those letters are available, both the originals and their transcripts. One of the things that comes up in the interview is Wallace asks Rand, "Well, how does your position really differ from someone like William Buckley?" Or Styles Bridges or Barry Goldwater. And for those who don't know, Barry Goldwater, he was a senator for I think a couple of decades in the U.S. Senate, ran unsuccessfully for president in 1964. Probably one of the most prominent conservative politicians in America at sort of in this mid 20th century period. And so Rand actually has some positive things to say about Goldwater, but does couch it in sort of the sort of, well, look, he has a book coming out. I'm very eager to read it, but based on what I know about him, there's a lot of really good things to hear. And so, of course, Goldwater does actually write Rand to say, hey, because Mike Wallace had a bit of a reputation as being, a liberal, and so Goldwater wrote a letter to Rand thanking Rand for defending his position. He says, I'm particularly proud of the fact that you were the one to defend my position because I have enjoyed very few books in my life as I have yours, Atlas Shrugged. And he sends her a signed copy of his book, Conscience of a Conservative. Well, of course, Rand, she's not just going to, rest on her laurels, so to speak. She writes him back after she reads the book, and you can read her, I think it's like an 8-page letter response to Goldwater, basically articulating all the things that she disagrees with. And just to kind of give you a highlight of that letter, I encourage people to just go read it because it's great. But basically, she says, the biggest error here is that you think that the United States is founded on these tried and tested principles that go back centuries and centuries. But no, the thing that is fundamentally unique and incredible about America is that it was radical and it was new, and that these ideas have never really been applied consistently. And that's something that comes up in this interview, is that America and its founding principles, were they applied consistently, that would be the fundamental thing that would sort of give it its moral and intellectual justification. So you basically see that she replies back. She replies back to Goldwater in that interview, as a result of that interview, I should say.
And in this interview, I see you can hear Wallace kind of like pushing back on many
Yeah,
of the points that Rand made, and it's hard for me to tell if he's expressing genuine disagreement or if he's channeling the audience and trying to get that like another perspective, or maybe both, right? But I'm interested if you can tell us more about the relationship between Rand and Wallace. Like, was there any disagreement? And if so, how was that dynamic working between them? Because you did mention that they met several times, and that um,
yeah.
that Wallace was sort of like this one person publicity machine for Rand. So can you elaborate on their
Right.
relationship?
Absolutely. Well, so I think the first thing to note is that, like I mentioned earlier, Wallace does have a bit of a reputation as being sort of on the left end of the political spectrum. But I think that that's kind of cool that, he clearly doesn't agree with her on several things, pushes back, pushes her to like give the answers, but does so in a way that I think is honest and respectful. And that's really the thing that's so cool and refreshing about these interviews is that it's somebody who clearly, like I said, doesn't agree with her, but does try to like ultimately, I think, in the process of honestly disagreeing, respectfully disagreeing, gets some great answers out of her, and she's really eager to like sort of meet the challenge. Now, when it comes to the specific disagreements, they get into a back and forth about government controls. What was it that caused the depression of the 30s? Was it laissez-faire capitalism? Was it government control? And you can see throughout the interview, like he's definitely trying to like find the contradictions in her view. Like, obviously he knows that she's an atheist and that, she's against religion. So when she's talking about her morality, he's like, so like, this is your religion, right? She's like, well, I wouldn't call it religion. It's my philosophy, she makes very clear distinctions. And then he says like, okay, so you want to like, just get rid of religion. She's like, well, I wouldn't put it that way. Like I wouldn't say get rid of religion by force or by law. That would be totally improper. So like, little things like that. And then another question, just to give you another cool example, Wallace basically says, like ask her this question about, who are the people you most admire today? And she says, well, unfortunately, like all the people that I most admire are like, they're pretty much all dead. And he says, wow, like you must really be an awful pessimist. And she's like, no, not at all. I'm the opposite of a pessimist because if I'm right, why do you think I come out and challenge 2,000 years of philosophy? The right ideas have always won. And so I think what Wallace respected about Rand is that he would always get great answers out of her, and in fact said so, both in the book 100 Voices, which is a collection of oral history interviews from people who knew Rand. And in that interview, Wallace basically says, yeah, I found her to be great company. And for context, Al Ramris, who had been a producer for Wallace, basically says that, the biggest crime to Mike Wallace was an hour of dull talk. And certainly when he knew that Wallace knew when he sat down with Randy was not going to be an hour of dog talk, not in the least. And so I guess it's no surprise that they actually kept up the relationship. They do have the 4 interviews together. We do have a letter exchanged between the two of them in, I think it's the mid 1960s, maybe 64, where Rand actually invites him to an NBI lecture, and Wallace accepts. And then in the photo collection here in the archives, we have a photograph of Rand and Wallace at a party together. And it's like circa 79, 1980, maybe 81, a party in Wallace's honor that she attended. And the two of them are posing together for a picture. So that just kind of goes to show you this was basically a relationship that lasted 2 decades. And they maintained that relationship. And we have evidence for it, throughout that period. So it's cool to think that, even though they had these disagreements, that they basically maintained a cordial relationship and that they clearly were getting value out of that relationship.
I want to circle back briefly to the point that you made about this sort of back and forth between them. And I want to say, I
Yeah.
listened to this interview, and that's one of the things that I found most interesting and amusing and actually entertaining. The back and forth between them. I really actually appreciated Wallace's pushback. I thought they were
Mm.
really insightful questions and challenges to Rand's position. And as usual, Rand, for those who have heard Rand in interviews before, she's incredibly witty and clever in the way that she responds, and she immediately has a really good response, and in a way that is very, very concise and precise. And a lot of it is Rand correcting the bad terminology or like the imprecise way that Wallace is putting some of Rand's thoughts, like saying like, "Oh, so this is your religion?" He said, "No, no, no, it's my philosophy." Um, but I want to turn to the logistics of bringing
Mm.
this quote lost recording to the public. You mentioned earlier that the recording was in a state at some point that was essentially inaudible and it was not
Yeah.
really publishable. So please say more about what it took to bring this recording to the public and sort of like the steps that the Ayn Rand Archives had to take to be able to do so.
Yeah, well, so like a lot of the things in our AV collection, sometimes people just send things to us over the course of, the last 40 years. And I've only been in the archives for 2 years, so I can't speak to all the things that have come to us. I'm just getting started sort of viewing all the things that are there. But essentially, we had a recording in the archives of somebody who basically held a microphone up to their TV and recorded the interview. Now, obviously, it's been 60 years. It doesn't sound great. It's not something that makes for a very pleasant listening experience. And we knew right away, okay, well, there's no way we would ever publish this, right? And obviously, it's barely good enough to make a reliable transcript. We really, my colleague and I, Audra Hilsey, really had to struggle to get an actual transcript of the interview to know what she even said. So we're looking, okay, where else is this interview held? And so I want to give a lot of credit to Lucy Rose, who suggested, hey, the Syracuse archives, they have the Mike Wallace papers. And if you look at their finding aid, it does indicate that there are these Mike Wallace Ayn Rand interviews. They're undated. It doesn't indicate, which interview it was, because obviously they did 4. Could it be that in the Mike Wallace papers over at the Syracuse archives, could it be that there's actually, the tapes that we want, high quality recordings in those archives? So, we figured, okay, well, it's certainly worth a shot. And I reached out and I found the Syracuse archives. They were so helpful in reaching, sort of helping us find what we were looking for. I basically gave them the information. They gave it back to me. So I want to give credit to both them, the Syracuse archives, and the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan, who gave us the copyright clearances and permission to basically publish this interview and gave us the permission to do so. So without their efforts and their collaboration, none of this would be possible. And it's a real credit to them that, they were willing to work with us to the extent that they did. And I will tell you that when I finally got the files, they sent them digitally, and I heard the clear, crystal clear, perfectly audible version of this interview that I'd listened to maybe 100 times trying to make that transcript. I leapt out of my chair and was so excited to finally hear a version of it that we could publish. We first published it at our OCON panel back in Anaheim, which was a couple months ago. We shared it again with our donors at a private donor roundtable. And now, just a couple of weeks ago, we're finally able to share it with the public. To go through that whole experience of bringing something to the public was so exciting. But the best part is we're not done, because as a part of all that material that we got from the Syracuse archives, we also got the 3rd interview that Ayn Rand and Mike Wallace did together. That was on April 14th, 1961, broadcast that day. And that just speaks to, I think, a broader effort that is so exciting, which is going out into the world, finding interviews like this. For instance, if Rand spoke at a college, finding, maybe somewhere in their archives, they have that audio, looking for these kinds of materials that are essentially lost. And I'm putting those in air quotes because they're just hidden in these archival repositories. And it's our, immense privilege to do the work to bring them to a public that I think desperately needs them. And that includes both, finding them in the archives, but then also pursuing the copyright clearances to make sure that we have the legal permission to publish them. It's incredible work, and really, I can't tell you what an honor it is to help make Ayn Rand more publicly accessible than she has ever been.
Yes, and that's part of our mission here, and I think the archives the archives is doing such an excellent job at doing this. And like I said earlier, like the fact that there's this 3rd interview that we haven't heard yet, that only very limited number of people back in the day may have heard, but no one ever since, essentially. And the fact that this is going to be released, I can't even begin to express how exciting that is to me, because I think, like you, I don't just work here, at the Ayn Rand Institute.
Yeah.
I'm a fan, and I think a lot of the people watching this video are also Ayn Rand fans that will share in this excitement. So a lot of exciting things to come from the Ayn Rand Archives. So Brandon, where can people watch this new interview that we've been discussing?
Yeah, well, so this is currently on our YouTube channel. I highly recommend people go down into the description, find it there. And I encourage you, watch the entire interview series. I think I can tell you that the first time I ever saw Ayn Rand on video was that first Mike Wallace interview. It had a profound impact on my life as a young man. I always show it to people when I really want to, people, it's like, oh, you work at the Ayn Rand Institute. What's she all about? These are the kinds of things that I like to share out there because it's easy for people to watch videos. So I encourage you, watch the first and second interview, watch the one that Mike Wallace did with her and Nikki Spillane, which is the fourth interview, and stay tuned on our YouTube channel. Subscribe so that you can actually be informed when the third interview is released, and much, much more. I can tell you, just in the coming year, we have a lot of material that you have never heard before. Ayn Rand audio that is coming. Our colleague Don Watkins, when this was released, he tweeted out, and I love this tweet. He says, the Ayn Rand Institute is the only place where you can hear new audio of Ayn Rand, however many decades after it happened, which is just so exciting and so cool for me.
That's really exciting, Brandon. So, can you tell us a little bit more, like, briefly, what other exciting projects are going on at the Ayn Rand Archives?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that coming up on February 2nd, which is Ayn Rand's 120th birthday, so she'll be turning 120 on February 2nd, 2025. One of the things I hope everybody tunes in for is we are actually playing the Raymond Newman interview with Ayn Rand, which was broadcast in 1980. I think it's probably one of her last interviews, and it's absolutely excellent. She talks excellent. She talks for an hour with Raymond Newman about a whole range of topics. You're going to want to hear it. To my knowledge, it cannot be found anywhere else online. So this is just yet another example of the kind of interviews and the kind of value that you can find here on our YouTube channel. If you want to hear it, you come to the Ayn Rand Institute first.
And I want to encourage people to go to the Ayn Rand Archives website and explore the page, because we also have exhibits, digital exhibits going on, right, Brandon? Can you tell us a little bit more about that briefly?
Yeah, so every year for OCON, we always bring an exhibit with us. We bring a little piece of the archives to our audience, and we totally understand not everybody can make it to OCON. So a part of our efforts is to basically take the content of the in-person exhibit, bring it online. We share just a selection of really cool materials. My colleague and I, Audra Hilsey, we basically worked on some commentary on these sorts of things. These include original documents. So one of the things that I really encourage people to look into, we have an exhibit called Blueprints for the Fountainhead, which basically 2 years ago, when we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the Fountainhead, we published both the original pages of her planning notes for that novel, as well as the transcripts, because let's face it, a lot of Rand's handwriting can be a little challenging to read for, modern audience. And we have all of this original unedited material out there. If you want to know what Rand thought while she was writing that novel, check it out. I also encourage you, like I mentioned earlier, the Letters of Ayn Rand exhibit. That is really extensive, but the unedited scans of the original letters are there online for free for anybody to access. And then our most recent exhibit was a project called Ayn Rand in Film and on Stage, where we basically explored her film career. So you get to see some really cool still shots of her, on the set of the Fountainhead movie in 1948-49 with people like Gary Cooper and some of the other famous Hollywood stars, and I think sheds a light on a lesser known aspect of her career. So something that we spent months on, these kinds of projects. Really excited for you to check them out. And it's the kind of thing where I think the best place to go is just go straight to the source when it comes to some of this archival material. And it's also accompanied by commentary by the archivists, myself and Audra, where you can gain the context to understand exactly what you're looking at.
The archives is such a treasure trove, and I encourage people to go explore the website, because a lot of the material in the archives, like as you said, Brandon, is available online for people to just browse and see what interests them. And I want to encourage people to donate to the Ayn Rand Archives, because this work is excellent, but it is costly. So people can go to aynrand.org/donate to donate to the Ayn Rand Archives. And now I want to highlight some resources for our audience if they want to learn a little bit more about Rand and this period of her life when she did this interview with Mike Wallace. We mentioned earlier, Rand, and this letter from Ayn Rand to Barry Goldwater, and we will include the link in the show notes. And for those watching, you can see the link on the screen right now. And we also want to reiterate the interviews that are currently available with Mike Wallace. We have the first, second, and fourth interviews with Wallace, the fourth including Nikki Spillane. And then those are the ones that are available right now. And then there's that third one that is coming, according to Brandon, and I'm really excited to listen to it. So, Brandon, Thank you so much for being here and for your expertise and knowledge and for sharing all of this about Rand.
Well, thank you so much. Anytime.
And to our audience, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this podcast. And please send us an email at newidealidrand.org if you want to comment on this episode or if you have ideas about other future episodes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.